Today's episode is brought to you by the Consultancy Growth Network. As you'll know, I'm a big believer in learning from people who've achieved the things that you want to. It's why I run this podcast, to share the stories of consulting leaders and how they've got to where they are today. So when I started talking to Mark Jansen and the team at Consultancy Growth Network, it was clear there was an obvious fit between climate consulting and their mission and what they are building with their network. But you're probably asking, what is the Consultancy Growth Network? The Consultancy Growth Network is the leading community of boutique consulting leaders. It brings together seasoned consulting growth experts who successfully scaled their own boutiques, with rapidly growing consulting founders looking to emulate their success. Now, you might be thinking, who are these growth experts? What do they actually know about consulting? And this is one of the most exciting things that personally I find about the network. The team at the Consultancy Growth Network have searched far and wide for some of the best boutique consulting leaders to help their members on their journeys, some of which I have previously interviewed for this podcast, such as Don Morehouse and Augusto Negrillo. But it's not just the insights from these people that you will benefit from. By joining, you get access to their jam-packed calendar of regular in-person and online events, their comprehensive growth hub of resources, and their active Slack community. Through all of these channels, you can learn, solve challenges, and achieve the goals you want for your firm. And now, if that wasn't enough reason to sign up, the Consultancy Growth Network is giving all listeners to this podcast a special sign-up offer. If you join for 12 months, you join for that next year, you will get your 13th month for free, giving you that extra month to continue to build on everything you're learning and continue to benefit from the network. To sign up, just visit consultancygrowthnetwork.com or contact their partnerships director, Luke at consultancygrowthnetwork.com. And when you're talking about joining, mention Create Engage or Climate Consulting, and you will get that special sign-up offer. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Climate Consulting. In today's conversation, you will get to hear all about a phenomenal consulting growth story of how one firm 20x their revenue and the secrets that helped them achieve that success. In this episode, I speak to Mark Palmer, former managing director of OEE Consulting, to share his story having done just that. Mark's journey is a fascinating one, and one that, as you will hear in this interview, almost didn't happen had it not been for a chance meeting at a dinner party. Now, fortunately for Mark, and fortunately for you listening, that chance meeting did happen, and the rest, as they say, is history. This conversation has so much in it, and we talk about a whole host of topics, from the importance of focusing on your clients to how to foster a culture where success and failure is shared by the whole team and everyone reaps the benefits. This episode has so much in. I loved this conversation. It was fascinating speaking to Mark, hearing the journey of OEE, and I know that you're going to get a ton from it. So with the intro done, please enjoy today's conversation with Mark Palmer. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nick.
So really looking forward to this. As I mentioned to you ahead of our interview, I knew about OEE for a long, long time before we met, back in my days as a process improvement consultant. So it's fantastic to put a face to a name, so to speak. And I'm looking forward to hearing all about the journey. For those of our listeners who may not know you so well, Mark, it'd be great if you could share an overview of your career and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, of course. Delighted to. So briefly, I left university in 1991. The economy was not in the best of shape at that point. So I took a role in Cardiff, working for an electronics company, making hi-fi. That was one of my first loves. That was a great first experience, but wasn't where I was going to spend my life. I'd always been a Francophile and very keen on the automotive industry. And the two things actually serendipitously came together with a job offer out in France for a big company called Valeo, who were the French Bosch. They're a $25 billion business, not particularly household name. And I took that opportunity and then ended up working for them for 9 years, predominantly in France, and had the opportunity to learn process, production, people, key account management, and came back right at the end of the 90s, having had a great experience. Then joined OEE, who we'll talk about later. So did 23 years there and sold the business in 2018 to a French startup, actually. And I use the word startup, WebHelp, because they had been going fewer years than OEE. They only started in the year 2000, but by the time we joined them, they were nearing 100,000 people. And they, in turn, were bought last autumn, which was the time for me to sort of not be put out to pasture, hopefully totally, but to take a sort of slightly slower route in terms of how many hours I do per month.
And how have you been doing with the slightly fewer hours per month, Mark? Have you been managing it?
I did very well at it for a period. Then I started saying yes to too much. And I think after about 8 months, okay now, actually, when I say 8, it's probably 9 or 10. But yeah, good now. But I ignored everybody's advice foolishly and said yes to too much for a while. But yeah, now good. And you don't want to do nothing, but doing something is definitely good for the soul.
Completely. And really keen to dive into, like you said, the whole experience and journey with OEE and to your point, selling to a startup, which, if I heard you right, ended up at 100,000 people. It's a very different definition to what some may have as a startup. So I'd love to hear more about it. I'm curious, though, you mentioned, and maybe just to start, because you talked about being a Francophile and wanting to go over to France and having spent, you spent almost a decade there, learned a ton. I guess maybe to start with, where did kind of your attraction to France and kind of that affinity with it come from? Was that family holidays to Eurocamp as was? Where did that start?
There was the several influences. Tony Blair often talks about this, your first teacher. So I started learning French at 8 and I had a very, very good teacher. So naturally, it was something that I was good at. And I think there's some logic in that what you're good at, you reinforce. My father was a Francophile, and his father was a fluent French speaker. He worked for a big French company called CGE, so Compagnie Générale d'Électricité. He worked on the cable that goes under the channel that joins our two countries electrically. So, and of course, yes, number of holidays in villas in the Dordogne and the Charente-Maritime in the early 80s. I think we were out there for the royal wedding and sort of went probably 5-6 years in a row to roughly the same area. So there were many influences.
Wow. And obviously we want to come to OE and your journey with the firm and building it. But how did those 9 years in France shape you? How sometimes you think France isn't that different because it's only across a very small sea, but actually, how did French business life differ, and how did that influence who you became and how you then came back to the UK with that experience?
So if we cast our minds back to 92, which is when I went out there, and in fact, I was in France for about 7 of the years I was with Valeo. I was some of the time in the States and some in the UK. Actually, it was a bit of a hodgepodge of career moves, all internally. But back in 92, I think France had invested in infrastructure. So you had things like Minitel, TGV, they had got the autoroutes, those sorts of things. The Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who only died recently, actually was a sort of technocratic president in the 70s, and he believed massively in investing for productivity. So that was the thing that characterized France at the time, probably less so today, but in those days, there was a sense of them having done the right things in terms of their infrastructure. And even the people who I worked for, if you didn't spend your investment budget, you were in trouble. So there was this sense that not spending your investment budget was a sin, but spending your OPEX budget or overspending was obviously a problem like in any other company, but not spending your investment budget was culturally what you got in trouble for. So that was probably the biggest difference that looking back now on what UK PLC looked like at the time.
It's a fascinating point, isn't it? Of actually, if you're driven to that to spend that investment budget, does that then drive that Did that drive that long-term perspective of you're investing for the future? Was there a pressure for returns to be delivered quickly with that investment budget, or was it that sentiment of as long as we're making the right decisions more often than not, it will bear fruit?
I think the context is different. So France is really high social costs around employment. So when you add, all the various health and pension and social costs to a French employee, you're looking somewhere between 40 and 48% on cost. So if if you contrast that, the UK, even probably an executive, you would struggle to get to 30, but the legal minimum, with the rather meager pension contributions that UK employers are obliged to make, struggles to get beyond 16. So when you're in that environment, productivity is super important. If you're going to employ people, you need to get the best out of them. And there's a fact here that high social labor costs may be resisted by employers, but what they do is they sharpen the focus on productivity. So I think it was a needs must, to be honest. But if you look at the stats, the French private sector, less so the public sector, but French private sector is rivals Japan in terms of productivity.
And I assume that is what led you into the area that you went to specialize in process improvement. If, to your point, you have to really make sure that productivity is at the top. Is that, and you mentioned Japan as well, is that, I guess, process improvement culture as prevalent in France? Did Edward Deming get to France, or where did that come from in France? Slight side point before we will get on to OE. I'm intrigued.
Yeah. So absolutely, Ono, Deming, all of those guys were very, very much prevalent in the thinking of the industrial leaders at Valeo. The group technical director had been at Renault Automation and seen Renault massively overinvest in automation that didn't work. And I would probably say we were, this is going to sound quite, what's the word, provocative, but we didn't focus that much on process, actually. And I guess this is we'll come on to this, how OEE won in the marketplace, is we focus much more on decision-making, on organization, on preparation, and testing hypotheses and making sure that we backed out of bad decisions and we backed good decisions. But there was very much test and learn focus. And we discovered through that organization and planning were much bigger drivers of getting things how they should be than the sort of traditional process piece. And I remain, relatively iconoclastic on that, I guess, is that I'm run what has been traditionally seen as a process shop, but no real lover of process. Albeit I do accept its importance, but I don't think that's where the keys to getting businesses to hum and sing lies.
Well, I think that is a carrot very well dangled. And so I think we should jump into the journey with OE, which will enable us to talk about exactly that. Because to your point, prior to meeting, I would have said you ran a process shop, and I would love to explore to what you've just said there, actually, that unique approach, what it was that let OEE win. Maybe to start, though, the journey to OEE, I would just love to touch on, because as I understood it, you were actually about to go to McKinsey before the opportunity to join OEE even came up. And I'd love to just understand that story, because again, for many people listening, the idea of joining McKinsey, that's the pinnacle of consulting for many people. Can you tell us about actually how that offer at OEE came about and what led you to take it?
So the McKinsey role offer came mainly because Valeo had been benchmarked by McKinsey as one of the best exponents of Lean, let's call it Lean, or the Toyota production system in Europe. And they were naturally on the hunt for people who had been involved in that movement of the business. So being bilingual, that obviously was helpful. And I'm probably not so bilingual now, but 20 odd years ago, I was very close. So there was a natural, and they quite liked the fact I wasn't an engineer as well, because at the time it was very much the engineering mindset sort of got in the way of adopting many of the principles that we were trying to to export and to use in the factories. But the real story is that my wife worked for EY, and her best friend and boss at work, with whom she job shared, invited us for dinner. And it was that person's husband who was a founder of OEE. And I shared my experience and shared what my probable next move was. And he just took the trouble to ring me the next day and said, have you considered joining a boutique rather than an established brand? And truth be told, I was wavering a bit. It seemed like a good idea because I wanted to get out of automotive. being the euro had just come in, Rover was falling over. So it seemed like a bad moment to be British and living in the UK and in automotive. So the getting out bit had been sorted in my mind. But I went to meet them, loved them. I met Philip, who was the MD before me, and Cormac, who was that fellow founder. Got on really well with them. So there was a chemistry and a fit. They also probably share my ruthless, my kind of classic approach as well, in that the no lovers of convention and like to perhaps shock in terms of not adopting that. The shock value always amused me. And I think the reservation at the back of my mind was, McKinsey, I know have had a lot of bad press recently, but certainly that wasn't the case then. But there are three types of people that join McKinsey. You've got the Oxbridge at 22. You've got then the top 10 business school MBAers. And then you've got people whose careers have gone really well in the first 6-7 years. But if you were to grade them, the third category, whilst you get in, there was a sense that people said to me that you are second, possibly third class citizen. Now, I don't know how true that is, but there was a sense with OEE that it was closer to who I was. I didn't go to Oxbridge, I didn't go to Harvard or London Business School. So there was really just a sense of being more comfortable in an environment that where my values were aligned, but also there was a sense of this was a better chemistry.
It makes a lot of sense. And to your point, it sounds like the right opportunity came at the right time. And to that point of shock and bucking convention, I get the feeling like there was always part of you that wanted to try being part of a smaller ship and taking a bigger hand in said ship. I'm intrigued, maybe it's a conversation for another time, how you found large corporates, or if you needed the large corporate to be able to do then what you did in building the boutique.
I've survived. I've worked for Lloyds Bank for a year. I've obviously worked for WebHelp now for 5 years and 9 years at Valio. So when you add it all up, I've done 15 years, and it was fine. Lots of great people. You do meet lots of great people in those businesses. The bit that always stood out for me during the financial crisis, during COVID, during different recessions, is that when you're in a small business, the good actions that you do are noticed and lead to positive results. The problem when you're in a big business is you can do the best actions possible, but you can end up in the wrong department in the wrong country. And guess what? You have done nothing wrong, but you're just a victim of a corporate decision which is taken perhaps in a different continent. I watched one of the Valio plants, Ingelseinen in Swansea, get shut down for reasons which I don't perhaps challenge, but it was the most productive, best plant pretty much in Europe. And why did it get shut down? Because it could be shut down. It was relatively easy to shut down. And you said to yourself that it felt unjust because they were running a great ship. And I think when you're working for a smaller company, that mismatch between input and output is avoided.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I love that piece, and we'll come on to it with the journey with OEE around actually the decisions and upside you can see and have that impact. And well, I'll take your lead here, Matt. I was either going to go for sort of themes across the whole journey or take our journey chronologically from you picking up the FS practice. Where helps you tell the story better? Is it the themes that you from thinking back over those 22 years, or do you want to go through the different passages of time?
I think chronologically works better simply because you learn as a leader. So there is an awakening on issues, and nobody has all the answers, do they? You get there as a team, but certainly for me, and there was a gradual learning from people that I met, from mistakes that I made, from colleagues who were hugely influential, and I was lucky to lead. So I think chronology works because that's sort of what happened.
Well, should we start there then and I'll let you fill in the gaps, as you joined, and at some point fairly swiftly you found yourself at the helm of the FS practice. And maybe if you could just give the headline of where it started, where you got it to. And then I would love to understand the journey, to your point, that you went on to build that practice? Because where you got it to, for many people, is a huge consulting firm in its own right. And so I'd love to, can you just paint the picture of where it was, where you got it to, and then what are some of those learnings, to your point, what are those enlightening, those awakening moments that occurred during that phase of growth?
So when I joined, the FS practice was tiny, had a great reputation, but revenues were probably 300,000-400,000 a year. Probably didn't make any money because it didn't always scope the work properly, so it overpromised, and never under-delivered, because that was one of the big pieces, that we would always do the delivery, even if it cost us. But the repeatability of work was difficult, so it was one-off projects. There were good relationships with, certainly one of the big banks at the time, but a sense of, what was our value proposition was unclear. So there was no real sense of what we stood for. We didn't really have a point of view, so we didn't put our head above the parapet. We didn't invest in relationships. We didn't invest in account management. So really, I had the hunch and the instinct that many of the things which I'd learned in the first 10 years of my career could migrate into consulting, albeit the consulting cycle, of course, is a very different business cycle to the one that I had in corporate. So I spent a couple of years learning really what the consulting cycle was. We have a mnemonic for it, which was, all about, we call it every consultant always does perfect interviews. So it's this idea of entry, diagnostic, and all the different things you've got to do. And I learned those, but alongside that, I was conscious that if we were going to build relationships, if we were going to be known for something, we had to define what it was. We had to give something back to those people that had backed us as well, and be the first to give, not expecting anything in return. And we had to wear out a lot more shoe leather in terms of meeting the people, spending time with the people, and helping them with their problems. So it was really two mantras that we developed. And I want to use the word we, because this story is very much about me and my team rather than me. So we had two mantras. So one was that there was a certainty of outcome promise. So whatever happened, we were not going to come back and ask for more money in the way that a lot of consultancies do. We were going to meet the terms of reference to the best of our abilities for the price quoted. So that was one. But the other one, which is probably even more powerful, was that the client had to be the hero of our narrative. So it's this idea that we wouldn't talk about ourselves and have, endless case studies and what we did, is that we would tell our stories through the, very much the perspective of the client, and talk about what the client did, and have the self-confidence that the success they had and our contribution would be inferred. So that is there anything revolutionary in that? At one level, no, but actually living it and doing it, and being prepared to put up with £250,000 losses on projects, and move away from the temptation to talk about yourself, which is what a lot of people are very good at. And gosh, I'm doing it today. No sense of irony, but those two things did mark us out as people that people wanted to work with, because there was the old saying that you never got sacked for using IBM. Well, that's sort of true, but what's true about that is that if things go wrong and you as a buyer have hired a brand, the brand goes under the bus. But if you as a buyer has bought a business like a boutique, but you as a buyer go under the bus. So you needed to de-risk that for buyers who really did get your gig and want to work with you. But equally, they were working in political corporates. So making the narrative about them was by far the most emotionally and politically intelligent thing to do.
Well, I really like both of those. And I want to come back to the steps as well, Mark. And I guess maybe start with, and it may sound obvious, but how did you make your clients the heroes, and what did you need to change as a team from when you joined to enable that? Because it sounds like if there's two sides of this coin, that's one of the biggest. What did you do day to day to make that shift?
A very practical thing is we stopped having case studies and we moved to client stories. So put a line through the idea of having case studies. and make people write the story of the project as a client story. It's a small thing, but that is a really, really big thing. We also introduced the NPS measure, which is probably a little bit sort of slightly out chronologically. But before we introduced the NPS measure, we got externals to come in and audit our work and very much look for fault. So we were people who were big supporters of ours. For about 3 years, they were interviewed every year, sometimes more regularly than that. And we were putting them some under pressure to say, well, look, for it to have been a better experience, what could they have done more? So we were not content with going home having got an 8 out of 10. We were very much looking, yes, we've got an 8, but what could we have done to get to a 10 was I guess the spirit of that. And it was painful. Honestly, I felt some of the feedback was unjustified for certain individuals. Collectively, it was spot on, but the way it zeroed in on some people was sometimes more perhaps a reflection on the person giving the feedback than the person receiving it. So you had to sift through all of that. But what we did create was an environment where what you were, and I learned this, at Valio as well, is this idea of welcome to the problems. So the person who's going to be congratulated is the person who's actually put their hand up and said, I can't do this, or I've got a problem, I need help. That is the bit that gets rewarded. The person that hides it under the carpet and then it all comes out in the wash and it's all too late, is not the sort of person you want on board. But as a leader, you've got to create the environment through role modeling that when people do come to you saying, I can't do it, that actually, there are no, repercussions for them, and that you learn from it and they learn from it, and you're stronger. So a lot of it was around leadership, role modeling, reinforcing the things that you said, not asking who, asking why, all stuff that we've heard. But there's a big difference between having it on a poster and then actually doing it day to day in your leadership role.
Completely get that. And to your point of things that sound easy on paper but are harder in practice, you mentioned you joined the practice, revenue was relatively modest, profit was fairly low because you touched on, in part, we were overscoping things. Obviously, one of those core tenets was the hero of the narrative, which we just touched on. The other core tenet was around certainty of outcomes promised. And how did you move as a team from, I guess, outcomes that were overpromised to outcomes that were promised to a point that was deliverable, profitable, and to bring in something else you mentioned, repeatable? Actually, how did you go on that journey?
So we started to, and I don't really like the word because I'm not but we did productize a lot of our offering. Yeah. So we wrote down what we did and we taught it to our people, but it wasn't just the tools. It was very much the secret sauce around it is, how do you get people on board? So there was as much of a people focus as there was a process or a tools focus. So there was stakeholder management. We emphasized that. There was, the what's in it for me, the change curve, how to do project management. So there's all the bits around it, which, nothing new under the sun really, but equipping people who, we'd taken the bet that we could take somebody at 35 out of a world-class manufacturing environment and turn them into a consultant. Now, the problem with that is you can get some great engineers and some great ops leaders, but not all of them are necessarily wired to talk about you rather than me, or me rather than you, whichever way around the conversation goes. So getting them to think in those terms and helping them with all the soft skills was part of it, having repeatable products. And I think the biggest bit, though, would be what I call working it up. So we can talk about this now, but the sales experience. A lot of people want to buy, but they're nervous. So what you can do is you can work up the solution well beyond what I call the concept stage. Bring it to life, make it visual, make it easy for somebody to imagine what it is that they're going to get as a result of of what is sometimes quite a big fee that you're asking. So de-risking it for them and I use this phrase, working it up. So, it could be layout drawings, it could be photos, it could be very detailed proposals if that's their preference. They might be the type of person that likes that. But for whatever's appropriate for that individual and tailor it for the individual, work it up such that actually you've taken it well beyond the concept phase. And this is something I learned. I did a big program between our French and German organizations in the turn of the century. And we understood that the French and the British, the word concept was something quite ethereal, quite, not very detailed. But where the Germans were particularly strong is a concept for them was an idea that had a business case, had got a timing plan, there were prototypes, you were pretty much ready to go. So really it was about moving us closer to almost a Germanic sense of a concept and away from a French and a British one, which tends to be not very detailed and not very worked up.
And how do you bring those? Because I do want to come on to sales, and we'll elaborate on it as a sort of a whole topic area later. But again, there's something in my head of you've come in, your goal is to grow a business area, your goal is to move it to profitability, and things like you said there, like that working it up sounds great. Again, requires hours to turn it into the Germanic type of concept. And I guess with all of these is how did you prioritize the time? You mentioned, and if this is where we bring it in, Mark, I'm happy to. You mentioned earlier around that focus. One of the differentiators was decision making, was preparation, was testing hypotheses. How did you, I guess, with what you've just described, like how did you decide what were the right decisions at those right times and make the time for the preparation and testing? Because it would have been very easy just to rush out and try and sell more work. How did you take that, some might say contrarian step back to plan all this out or test all of these things?
So I think the truth is that a win ratio is the best thing to concentrate on rather than chasing lots of opportunities. So the discipline was to say, we will qualify out things that we don't think we've got much of a chance of winning, but we will spend a lot of effort on the things that we will. And at the time, people were living with 15, 10% win rates in consulting. They were responding to lots of public sector bids, for example. They were going to go on to big organization frameworks where they perhaps didn't have the strongest Dun & Bradstreet rating or the necessarily quality certificate. So for us, there was a ruthless targeting of opportunities. And we did that through the sort of Miller-Hyman process of strategic account management planning. So you're starting to put your eggs in relatively few baskets, which is contrary to a lot of business thinking. So, we went after about 4 clients and we got very close to those 4 clients. And most of them were in financial services. So that helped with the area I was working in. But what it does do is that it means that you develop a honed point of view, which is relevant to your client's problems. And I think that is the big learning for a value proposition, is that most people think about value proposition in terms of what can I do and what are my capabilities, even worse. But we did understand quite early on that a value proposition is what value are you going to add to a client. And at the time, it wasn't as edgy as I would have wished it for it to be, but getting underneath the skin of what your client's problems are means that you can be relatively proactive in terms of suggesting ways to do that, i.e. fix them. So that was, I think, a big part of that. But also, I'm a big believer in making decisions and failing fast. So you can make a lot of decisions knowing that a lot of them are going to be wrong, as long as you're very good at then understanding that they're wrong and unraveling them quickly as well. Some people probably thought I was impetuous, couldn't possibly comment, but there was definitely traction and energy and momentum from making decisions, getting it wrong, learning that doesn't work and moving on to the next thing. And I guess the final bit, which is slightly tangential thought, but it just popped into my head, is we met somebody, and I can't remember his name. If he's ever listens to this, I'm going to apologize. But he brought this concept of sticky marketing to us. So he said to us, look, the digital world has changed everything. You've got to remember that in the mid-noughties, the internet was still was being referred to as the interweb and all sorts of things. And but he said, look, now don't shout about yourself. Don't spend lots of money on advertising. You need to be easy to find. So to be easy to find, that's probably going to be on the digital channel. But if you're going to be easy to find, what are you going to be famous for? So go for a niche, go be the biggest and the best in a niche, and be brave, be bold, be uncomfortable in that niche. And I think, those two pieces of advice were massive for us. So we stopped spending money, on that traditional sort of shout mechanism, and we spent a lot more effort on being easy to find. And then when people found us, to have loads of energy to turn that into an opportunity. And I read very much as an HBR article that was in Chartered Institute of Personal Development around that time, where some journalist had been to Harvard and he'd realized actually that all the best businesses had one thing in common. It wasn't a great strategy. It wasn't necessarily great people. It was a fantastic ability to respond to the opportunities that came their way. And he made the point that most organizations do have enough opportunity. What you think of all the big corporate failures, Kodak, there's a long list of them. There were moments in their history where you can see there were people lobbying for the right answer. It wasn't as if everybody in that business was committed to failure. So the thing for me was to say, right, what we do absolutely need to be is really fleet of foot when an opportunity comes our way. And as long as it's, in our sweet spot in terms of the value that we offer and, of course, the capabilities we possess, let's put loads of energy behind it rather than backing things that sort of vaguely sound a good idea but are realistically, when you put the probability question about would they ever choose us, could we do it, would we make any money, et cetera, would our people enjoy doing it, it all comes to a resounding naught. Whereas lots of organizations seem to pursue those opportunities that when you put them through those type of questions sieve, quite obviously a complete waste of time.
No, I think that really honing in, and your example of that Harvard article and actually it's the people who can close and capitalize that are the most successful. I think it's a fascinating one, Mark. I really hope you are enjoying today's episode of Climbing Consulting. If you want to get ahead, you want to move your consultancy, your career forward, and you want to learn even more, then I would definitely recommend checking out our brand new marketing-focused podcast, Brand and Deliver. In this series, we dive in to the best, the latest, the newest in consulting marketing and professional services marketing at large to help you get the edge in your firm. If you go to your podcast app, type in Brand and Deliver, it'll be there, or go to our website to podcast and you can find it there and click your favorite episode. I hope you enjoy it. A couple of other bits in just what you mentioned, because I run a marketing agency. So I am not going to open up the sticky marketing conversation just because I agree with everything. And it would feel self-congratulatory to have a conversation where I agree with you and myself about all of the things you just said. There were two things there that I'd love to explore just because they were fascinating. One, it was a throwaway, and I suspect it's a good lesson for some of our listeners. But you mentioned around value proposition, and I didn't capture the words exactly, but I think you mentioned knowing your value. Some consultancies at the worst end align value with just capabilities. And I'd just be curious why that's an issue for you, and particularly for our listeners. Our listeners are people building consulting firms, running consulting firms, working into consulting firms. And they might think, of course, my value is, I'm a process consultant, so that's my value. Why are those different?
They're different because what you do for a client, the tools are just for me, or the methodologies are just a means to an end. So I'm working with a digital consultancy at the moment, and I think it's a really good point. They, I think, thought that their value proposition was around automation and around digital transformation. But we went through a great exercise, and and I had this hunch, and I'm pleased it ended up with where my hunch was, that the real value they added was for big legacy companies that weren't very digital, was getting them to a place where we could actually transform their sort of slightly broken and disjointed infrastructure so that it could be much more modern and give a better user experience and a better client experience to their customers. So all that really is happening in that instance is that the automation capability, the digital capability, is a means of fixing broken infrastructure for them to deliver better client and user experiences. So now that they've positioned themselves as an organization that is fantastic at transforming what I would call legacy organizations that have been a little bit left behind, that's got loads and loads of traction. And I think initially they were very uncomfortable about going so narrow. But the bit which I had to sort of convince them of was to say, you will still get technical buyers who will buy you for your capabilities, but you're sort of going to get them anyway. The big deals that you want are the people who want to see their landscape transformed and want to be able to win more work in a B2B environment, or want to hang on to their B2C customers by having a much less friction in the business when they deal with you. So, we need to go for the people who are going to be buying transformation, commercial buyers who are not going to buy a series of 8K projects. They're ones who are going to back you with 100,000, 200,000, maybe multi-billion pound deals to get them to a place that solves their business model problem. So, and that's worked. I'm pleased to say that has worked. And for us, it was the same. For ages, we did lean, we did data, we did spreadsheets as far as I could see. Lord knows what they did. But when we finally got to our nirvana, we were very, very good at the onboarding customer journey for service operations. And once we got our clarity around the value that we added for businesses, clearly all our capabilities, process improvement, technology integration, organization, preparation, training, soft skills, coaching, they all came into play. But the fundamental problem that you find across not just UK PLC is that the onboarding of new customers and new clients fails. And if you can be very, very good at helping organizations to fix that, you have a powerful capability, which actually in that instance is a value proposition as well.
I think that's a brilliant example, Mark, and talks to that point of sticky marketing you mentioned earlier around finding your niche and actually being confident in that niche. That example you gave of the business you're working with, that niching has helped them. I suspect, as you said, there were some challenging conversations and decisions around making that the niche because, and we all know in consulting, there is the fear that if you niche, you lose the opportunity to serve everyone else. And I think what I'm hearing you say is actually it's that niche that really makes you the value player in that space, and you'll still pick up work around that outside of that niche within your capabilities. But going to market as a capability is not the thing that sets you apart.
Yeah, and I'd like to pay tribute to that organization, by the way, who have gone for it, and it's working for them. So had the courage to go through that process. And, and I didn't facilitate it. It was another organization with whom I worked did it. And to see that transformation and that transition is, it reminds me of the journey that we went on. But when you see the results as well, your conviction doubles down on it. So, pay tribute to them. They've done a great job.
No, and I think a great also case study for anyone listening, because seeing it means you believe it and means you can then do it somewhere else. And so people hearing you have had that journey, obviously we'll come back to the OEE journey, but with this firm as well, I think it's a great data point. And the other point I wanted to pick up on, Mark, because it will be interesting for our listeners who are running boutiques, because the other day I was at the Consultancy Growth Network's annual report announcement, the bench press interviews hundreds of boutique consulting leads, and you got the FS practice to, I think it was 4 million. So for a lot of firms, that's as big as their firm ever gets. But there was something interesting you mentioned around your approach to decision making, and that you're very happy to make a decision, and if it doesn't work, quickly change course. I'd be fascinated, how did you and how do you do that in a way that brings people on the journey? Because the age-old frustration can be, oh, well, the MD or the founder or the practice head, or they've changed their decision again, and just people get change fatigue. How did you balance that ability to move quickly with the risk of, as I say, that change fatigue and losing people along the way?
The first bit is, happily, over 50% of the decisions that we took were the right ones. So I think you're not allowed to make 99 bad decisions and one good one. Somehow along the line, the ratio's got to be in your favor. So that's that.
Casinos
I
only need
think
51%.
Yeah, exactly. So I was, and we were better than that, I think, as a first thing. I had some really good people as well. And we had a situation where I was able to say, right, our remuneration, our outside salary and pension is going to be based on a collective. So we're not going to have any individual targets. We are going to collaborate and we're going to get there because of the power of our collaboration, as opposed to the old traditional one is I tee you up with a target and off you go and try and deliver it. I was very aware that there's somebody who opens the door, somebody who prepares the proposal, somebody who delivers it, somebody's probably going to lead the program, somebody's going to be the relationship manager. That could be one person. It's likely that it's somewhere between 5 and 3. So if you're going to win, none of those people should be competing with each other. So that meant that the mistakes that we made them collectively. There wasn't a siloed organization. And as we trusted each other, and the trust comes also from the role modeling we've talked about, but also from having that, not having individual targets. I think they are massively corrosive. I've always fought against them. I'm no lover of many of the performance review things that you get as well. I've seen them more recently linked to the bonus you get. All of these things, Elton Mayo and the Hawthorne studies and all these things teach us, book 1, page 1 of your organizational behavioral MBA tells you that all of these things are rubbish, yet big corporates still do them for some reason. Still don't understand why, when the very people who are developing them have been on those courses. But hey, because we were able to be different to that, and we were able to do away with all of that sort of corporate, what I would call painful infrastructure. We were learning on the job, and we were failing together and succeeding together. And I really would like the narrative of this as well, and I hope it comes across, because I do tend to say me and I too much, and my wife in particular picks me up for that. But this was very much about 10 to 15 individuals, right time, right place, right attitude. And I probably was at one level the right person to lead it at that time, mainly because I was not too worried about popularity. I had this sort of expression that leadership is not a popularity contest. What I wanted to do was I was massively driven for us to succeed, but for those around us to do well out of it as well. And I think they understood that this was about a collective, and all the behaviors and the measures underpin that.
I think it's very fair, Mark, and completely get to say, as you said, we are talking, but there is a wider we that has achieved that success. To the point, you made the decisions, and as a team, you were right more than you were wrong. I'd be fascinated, what were your rules for deciding to call something? Because it can be hard to distinguish between a failure versus something that hasn't yet borne fruit. We've all seen LinkedIn now is littered with motivational memes and pictures and little videos. And, we've all seen the man with the pick who, if he just dug a little more, would hit the gold. And what were your criteria for deciding, no, this is time versus this needs more time?
I think you've got to trust your instinct, first of all. I think a lot of people go along with something because they don't want to upset somebody who thinks they've had a good idea. I think a healthy amount of skepticism as well is good. And I'm a big believer that actually something that everybody believes in that might be a bit teeny weeny bit wrong is better than something that is right but nobody believes in. So there is a sense that we would go off on things which were probably not perfect, but strategizing about them for another 2 years, well, they were definitely not going to work then. So I think one example was a good friend, Brian Brody, who was very senior executive at RBS, when he moved to a company called HML, he approached me and said, I'd like to set up a club. And I said, oh, yeah, I like that. That sort of fits with sticky marketing, that we sort of need to hang around in the right spaces. There's no point hanging around at HMRC or the Houses of Parliament if you're, running the type of organization that I did. But if you're an accountancy firm, you know where to go. You're a law firm, you know where to go. But if you're really good at operations and onboarding, there is nowhere to go. So why don't we build it? We make our own. So he and I did that, and it was good. It was called, I think, the Lean Service Forum initially. But over time, we realized, the Lean is a bit, although I'm still a big believer, its brand had got a bit damaged by some of the stuff that was in the press. So it became the Service Excellence Forum, and then it became the Future of Service. So, and actually, once it got to the Future of Service, that was a really good, what I would call, wrapper for us to do quite a lot of cool stuff. But we would never have got there if we hadn't have started with the Lean Service Forum. So the evolution into something that, for me was a huge part of how we built the brand and how we got people to engage with us and be front of mind with them. Because you're not really selling. I don't think, the most successful revenue organizations aren't really sales organizations. But what you were doing is that you were building enduring relationships with people who mattered, and having a point of view that people recognized you for would perhaps sometimes make them smile, but would make you memorable and make them pick up the phone when an opportunity that they saw fitted you, that then they would come knocking on your door. So I think that's a good example of making sure that you were broadly doing the right thing, but it wasn't honed, but we didn't damage ourselves by getting started and getting it slightly wrong.
Well, and I love that point, Mark, as well around, and I infer, but I'll ask, an idea that has someone's energy and passion behind it is better than an idea that is agreed but has no one's energy and passion behind it. And that's the sort of sense I get.
Yeah, it's a much better way of saying it. Thank you. Great paraphrase. But yes, absolutely that.
And I might be jumping a bit here, but I think we're touching on some really great themes. And to bring us sort of through the OEE journey. So you'd led the FS practice, you'd grown it. I mean, firstly, you'd grown it 10x, which I realized we should probably just touch on, because you joined at 400,000 revenue, you took it to 4 million. That's quite a growth. How long, can you just, for our listeners, how long was that time frame?
So it's hard to put it on it. I think did I ever really take over the FS practice with that job title? No. Did it happen because all the clients who were in FS were effectively my clients at a certain point? Well, yes. So I would say I started to become confident in driving revenue around 04, 05. And so some of the growth had happened, whilst I was program managing, but it was somewhere between 04 and 08 that we sort of took off. And we had a couple of very big clients who backed us. So it was driven at that point, whilst we probably had 15 to 20 clients, 80% of those revenues were coming from two very large UK retail banks where we had very, very good trusted relationships.
Wow. Part of me really wants to ask the question around client concentration, but I also don't want to go too technical into the day-to-day management of consulting. Why don't we move into the next bit of the story, Mark? And you can tell me how pertinent or relevant that sort of client concentration was. Because as I understood it, you, around the time of the financial crisis, took the helm as MD of the whole business. And so maybe it's quite pertinent. 80% of revenue, I think you just said, from the whole firm was coming from two clients. You hit 2008 when I assume most banks stopped giving any revenue to consulting firms, and you took the helm of the business. Tell me about that period, because then we can come on to the growth that followed.
So, you're right. Our revenues went down 30% very quickly, which proves how foolish it is to have too much revenue with two clients. But equally, so the day I took over was Black Monday. And within a few days, we were down to £250,000 a month. So we were actually down at really, an annualized business of 3 million. So we went down quite quickly, because the 4 million, remember, wasn't though the whole business. We were in the nuclear sectors, we were in energy, we were in some manufacturing companies as well, and service companies. So business probably went from sort of 6 million annualized to half that very quickly. But we were not burning cash, at that level. We weren't making any money, but it was survivable. And of course, I did say to myself, we mustn't find ourselves quite so exposed to banks in the future, and we didn't, apart from one year during the PPI scandal, where there was sort of an opportunity that where one bank, did need our services, and it was foolish not to pursue that opportunity. But we did start at that point to imagine sectors. So whilst I'd gone strategic account management, which is sort of phase one, we started to think early then about sectors: banking, insurance, health, utilities, and they didn't happen and mature until later in the journey. But there was definitely a sense of wanting to be more broad. But again, that was about opportunity, because we tried to sell just prior to the financial crisis, failed, but in so doing, built an incredible network of people who were interested in buying us. So once the sales process, because there was no liquidity left in the world, had stopped, the same people that we had met but became either clients or friends. So we actually managed to build out into hard services, into investment banking, so away from retail banking, into health, into security. So we, I guess, took the opportunity of a failed sale to build the breadth of our client base, and we won an enormous amount of work through the fact that we didn't sell. So it's really back to my Harvard article, really, is that you turn an experience into an opportunity, even if it didn't actually end up where you originally intended. But that sort of doesn't matter. I guess that's really what's coming through a lot of what I'm saying now, is that if you remain alive to opportunity, and if people understand that you are fundamentally a decent business and that you would treat as you would be treated, then there is a great circularity in life. Good things happen. People like people, and people like people who they trust, and people see your value set. I'm going to run away from a value proposition for a moment here. A set of values is nearly as important, or certainly equally as important, as a value proposition.
No, I like that. And it's something, and now might be the right time, Mark, or not, because I'm really keen. Obviously, the 2008 to 2018 growth journey was equally as rapid and sort of large. And there's something, this might, to your point of journey, come in here of, I know when we spoke ahead of this, you mentioned you were never afraid to back people and never afraid to let people go, which I suspect ties into that value piece. And I'd be curious how that people piece played into your growth, because I assume to grow at the pace you did, you had to back people. And I assume you also at times had to let people go. How did you know when for both of those? And how did you approach those to keep those relationships, to make them succeed and to keep those relationships positive?
So the first thing is, I'm a big believer you back people right up to the moment that you don't. So what you tend to get in organizations is that people make up their mind on somebody not being very good, and then they'll spend a year undermining them, definitely making sure that they're no good. And I don't agree with that approach. Of course, I don't agree with that approach. Who would? But it happens. So my mantra is that, yes, there may be a doubt about somebody, but we need to give them every single chance. So that might be a changing a role. That might be a change of line manager. That might be send them away for some support and some coaching. That might mean in certain instances, we would invest in, almost deeper psychological support and sort of trying to understand if there was a key that we could unlock to help them. There's a great book which I've discovered, and I think I might have it here actually. Here we go. Derek Draper. You might have heard of Derek Draper. So Derek Draper died recently. He was the husband of one of the TV anyway, one of the ITV presenters, so he famously died during COVID, but he wrote a book called Create Space, at how to manage time and find focus, productivity, and success. Robert Peston is a fan. And essentially this is this idea that people very often, the reasons that they're not doing what you want them to do are nothing to do with work. They're nothing to do with what you could ever imagine. They're deep-seated. And we did have some success in helping some people turn a big psychological corner because we invested in them, because we could see, how much potential there was, and it was worth really going for it.
I'm fascinated about this topic, and I would love to understand, to your point, I think, particularly in consulting, and I worked in FS consulting as well, so I know the FS as well. Very fast, people make decisions very quickly. There's something quite profound in that. Everything you were just saying, if we actually invest underneath that, we dig in psychologically. There's also a question, and this might be of today's world versus previous worlds, I don't know, of we live in a world where everyone is very open, but there can be very hard boundaries as well. My work life is different from my personal life. I'd love to, and I know you can't share the actual individuals, but how you unlocked that for people, and what were those tools? What was the process? How did you do it? Because that sounds quite profound, Mark.
For me, we also had a lady who worked for us who was based down in Fulham, who was an occupational psychologist. So she was very, very good at getting people to talk, but to understand their motivations and to find out why things were the way they were. So she never divulged to us the details, but with the individual's approval, we were able to identify themes where they needed support. So, here we are dealing with technology and process, as you've suggested. They were fantastically talented people, but there was other stuff going on that was getting in the way. Now, not everybody comes out of that process refreshed and gets to a place where they can succeed. But over 50% of the time, we managed to get people to a place where they got it off their chest. They now understood why they were the way they were. And even if you don't want to change how somebody is, what you can do is you can develop strategies, coping strategies, or you can put them in situations where the problems that you'd seen aren't going to manifest themselves. So don't put somebody who is very, very capable, fantastic at delivery, but really hates the idea of selling, don't put them in an account manager role. And a lot of people are thinking, well, if you're going to be a management consultant, you've got to be good at account management. You've got to be good at project management. You've got to be good at selling. And I'm sort of saying to myself, well, you do want some people, and a healthy number of those people. We do need some people who the client trusts to only really be focused on the beauty of the thing and the delivery. So it's then about playing people in roles where you play to their strengths, but matching them with client profiles. So hunching profiles, looking for chemistry, and having the bravery to pull people out of projects and clients, not punish them because it hasn't worked, but be honest with the client and say, look, we need to find a different solution because clearly the chemistry isn't there. We had one client in America who shall remain nameless, who would ring us up every 6 months and said, oh, I think I've broken another one. Sorry, can I have a new one? And it was, and some people would say, well, why are you still working with that client? Well, actually, that client realized that they were at fault and there was no recrimination on the individual. So it has been very alive to preferences, that the world is different. It takes all sorts of people to succeed, not to have this sort of Xerox copy approach. You have to conform to this profile. But again, create an environment where people felt that going and getting support was because you were wanting somebody's career to progress, not because it was about performance management.
Mm. I really like that. And I guess there's within that, Mark, and this might come back to your French influences, is there is that theme of investing in your team for the long term, because actually, to your point, it's quite a contrarian thing to do if you have concerns about someone's capability to then invest in this process, because I can't imagine this psychologist was cheap. I can't imagine that the management time of thinking about it was cheap. But actually, it sounds like it bore fruit, as it were. But is that a fair reflection of that investment approach came from that time in France? Was it something that your other colleagues had? Because I would know many other consultancies who probably would have performance managed these people out rather than doing the thing you did.
I've read two books in my life, probably slightly linked to France, but not French books. So one is called The Strategy of the Dolphin, which is a whole concept of that dolphins beat sharks because dolphins work as a team. And if you see in nature, a shark attacks a dolphin, shark will generally lose because the whole school of dolphins team together and they take it in turns to batter the shark in the side of its flanks. And they take it in turns, and in the end, the shark disappears. Yeah. Whereas the shark is a classic win, lose, lose, lose strategist. The dolphin is a win-win strategist. So I think it was a lovely metaphor for a period in my life. I'd lost a member of the family. I was, had come out of university with no job, probably feeling a bit low. And a lovely guy, Clive Bevan, who hired me into Valio, suggests that I read this book as a sort of a means of traversing the new period of my life of moving out to France, speaking broken French. So, but then there's another really good book, which is all about transaction analysis, a really simple book, which is it's called I'm Okay, You're Okay. And loads of people will have read this book. But this sense of I'm okay, you're okay is all about saying that if I'm okay, i.e. with myself, and I'm not out here to prove and to put you down. I'm here to support you. So you're okay because I'm okay, actually. And I did not want to project onto people that they weren't okay because they weren't necessarily succeeding. There was this sense that you definitely will be okay once you start to understand that you are okay. Yeah. And I think that most organizations put pressure on people, and that whole process of performance management starts with telling somebody that they're not okay. And I just don't think you're ever going to win if you start with that logic. You've got to start with the logic that fundamentally they are okay. Now, I'm going to argue with myself now, because if after lots of effort and lots of energy and backing somebody, fundamentally it's not going to work, then I think you need to make a decision really quickly. There's no point putting them on projects where they're going to damage your brand, where they're going to upset other team members, and they're going to consume any more management overhead. You need, in the nicest possible way, to part company, to look after them financially, to recognize that it was probably not the right place, that it can be just as much about you and your organization as it is about them. But to do it absolutely humanely, and in many cases, those people, as I mentioned to you before, Nick, they've gone on to be clients, they've gone on to be friends, they've gone on to be people who have not felt bitter because it hasn't worked with us. It's been very much contextual than about them, and I think that's really important. Is that context is everything.
Well, firstly, you're the first person to ever mention either of those books on the podcast, and we're about 150 of these in. So I'm going to look up both. And I love The Strategy of the Dolphin. I assume I don't need to read the rest of the book now. You've given me the headlines, but I also I think that point around the starting performance from a place that everyone is okay. And actually, it's funny. You talk about how different management theories. I guess that's the problem with a lot of performance management theories. It starts with someone is not okay, and that's why you've got to talk to them about it. But I love what I think I heard you say of actually, you give these opportunities. You in your case, you invest in the psychologist, you move the project, you move the team, because sometimes it is, it's not the player, it's the game or it's the team, and actually moving those around, but then having that very, I guess, honest conversation to just say, this is not for you, rather than HR them out with performance improvement plans and all of that stuff. Because yes, you did. I wanted to ask you about how you remain friends with many of the people you exited, because I suspect for a lot of listeners, that's going to be quite hard. And maybe, Mark, just because it ties into that, you were obviously leading the business, you were obviously growing the business, and your team were. When you're on a growth trajectory, I imagine it can seem, if you've got an underperformer, how did you avoid ill will towards them if you're thinking, well, we could be growing, X times faster if so-and-so was actually good, or if we'd replaced so-and-so? How did you I imagine, keep that long-term perspective to enable you to have those relaxed conversations or hard conversations in a positive way. I shouldn't say relaxed, hard conversations in a positive way.
I think it goes back to not really attributing performance to an individual. I talked about not having individual targets. So we were quite an amorphous mass, which would not appeal to everybody. And a lot of people would like to think, well, I've done that, and that's what's happened as a result. I've given that person this rise, and they've now sold more. And that's not how it works, of course. It's a business is a system, and it's a complex system. And I felt all along that if we behave badly, not that I was ever tempted to do, but I knew that you're going to damage the gig. You're going to, we had a riff, we had a gig, we had fun, we were iconoclastic, we were cynical about the business world, and we would muck around and would be very, rude to each other. There was, some of the arguments in the board meetings are just legendary where we would disagree. But I knew, and this is perhaps a bit French, that outside of the meeting, we were friends immediately afterwards. It was very much a professional thing. But if you then start to sort of sever people because one project hasn't gone well, my sense was that's going to be much more damaging to the business than if you go down a path of actually being a little bit more considerate and thoughtful about it. Because we're trying to build something that would last. It didn't last 100 years, but it did last 25 years, which for a startup and and it's still going today. It's not over. It's very different today, the business, and I wish the new direction every luck. Those people who are leading it all the best, but it is very different now. The company is part of a big American corporate and sort of almost lost its consulting identity recently, but it is still a very worthwhile, very successful business division in a company. But in terms of, you're not going to build anything if you create an atmosphere where people are petrified to make decisions and petrified of getting it wrong. But you are going to build an environment where people want to join you if people feel that they're going to be rewarded for doing the right thing, that they can plead for forgiveness rather than permission, and that going out on a limb and being empowered, and I don't like the word, but I think it probably is right here, empowered in front of a client is going to give them power with that client base. I did not want a world where people would say, oh, well, I'm going to have to ask the boss if I can say yes for that. It's hopeless. They're just seen as a complete minion in the business. And if you're ever going to delegate and grow, you need people to feel that their clients to feel that they call the shots that matter to them. So if you're going to create that environment, you're going to have to accept that people get things wrong.
I think it's a great point. And I did have on my sort of notes to ask you about the Glassdoor score, which I think I saw as over that time was a 4.7 out of 5, which in whatever ratings you use, that's a good score. Is that what you just described? Is that what you felt caused those ratings, that culture, that feedback, that 4.7 out of 5? That's top. Well, whether you call it quartile, that's a very, very good score. And the nice thing about Glassdoor is it's anonymous, so people don't have to be nice. Is what you just described? Well, 0.3 of them weren't.
Yeah. I attribute it to a few things. Look, the team, first of all, I mentioned it before, that I had a absolute fortune that what I inherited in 2008 perhaps wasn't a great order book, perhaps wasn't a particularly profitable business, but it had enormous potential. With the hiring strategy of the business that both, that predated me and during my tenure had been really good. We had a fantastic recruitment process that had been invented by the founders. So I inherited something that was, really robust. It was a huge strength of the business. Great values, great people, bright people, flexible people, hardworking, innovative, all of those things. So it meant you could delegate to them and know that their hunch and their instinct was good. So that is not everybody gets a situation like that when they become a leader. So that was a huge part of the success. I think also because we wanted to develop the brand, we joined the MCA, we wanted to win awards. But a little thing was that we went for sort of the Best Company Awards for a Better Workplace, which was sponsored by the Sunday Times. And when we went in for those awards, what we did do is that the feedback we got, we acted on it. So we actually had a huge project that the feedback that the people gave us, we took seriously. So we wanted to work on diversity. We wanted to work on social responsibility more. We needed to work on the parental, how we helped people when they became parents. There were all sorts of things as we grew that we came from a boutique place and we hadn't really worked hard enough. So what happened was that it was less the actual survey. It was more that over a period of years, people could see that what they put as constructive feedback in the survey was getting fixed. So there was this sense of, we can say something, it won't get swept under the carpet. Nobody's going to try and bonus us for giving them a good score, a bit like when you buy a new car or something like that, where they beg you to give them a 10, otherwise they're not going to get a bonus, absolute nonsense. And you get that in large corporates where people say, well, it'll reflect badly on us if you put a bad score. Again, where are we going with this? We accepted bad scores and did something about them. And over time, the scores were good, not because probably we had become an amazing company, but because everybody was so motivated by the fact that when you said something, it actually led to something positive, and that we listened. And that momentum, I think, is what got us to the 4.7, as opposed to possibly some of the stuff we've talked about. Hopefully that was part of the core of it, but getting us to an extraordinary level, I think, was the Sunday Times Award was really important.
Well, and it ties back to what you mentioned earlier, Mark, and that theme of you need to be that role model. And if your team see that you're acting on the feedback, that cycle of more feedback that is then implemented, which makes it a better place to work, just that loop continues, that flywheel continues. If you are enjoying today's episode, I would love to hear your thoughts. We thrive on feedback, and it would mean so much to me if you could take 10 seconds to go to your podcast app, leave us a review, and let me know how we are doing. Let me know what this podcast is doing for you. Let me know what you would like us to see, what guest you would like to hear from next. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better for you and for all of our other listeners. Thank you in advance. And now let's get back to the show. And I might turn us here because there was another piece of feedback you mentioned earlier around NPS, and you might tell me the answer is the same just on the client side, but you had a very high NPS as well. I think it was plus 54. So, most people listening to this will be familiar with what that means, but that's very high. How did you approach that client relationship, that client feedback? Was it exactly what you just described with employees, but the same with clients? Take, listen, act, do. I think it's the DMAIC cycle, but I'll let you tell me.
Yeah. Plan, do, check, act. Yeah.
If we turn to I think what you'd said on the employees makes lots of sense and is a great approach to follow. How did you do the same with clients?
It was, you guessed it. It was very much the same, but it was through the lens, still using the strategic account management planning. I'm still a disciple of that, you need to find out where you've gone well, where you haven't gone well. You need to act upon it. And at certain times, you need to change the people. I have this joke that change management sometimes means precisely that, change the management. That is an important thing to remember. But you can overdo it. A client will say, well, hang on a minute, I spoke to you 6 months ago about this and nothing has changed. So, so there's danger in doing that type of survey if you don't mean it again. So we moved away from 6 months to yearly, mainly on the basis that we weren't getting any more valuable information every 6 months as we were every year. And because of the time cycle, the life cycle of budgets, projects, the economy, it didn't make any sense to do it more regularly. But yeah, you're right. It was very much about what you've said. We will act upon it. And if there's anything serious, clearly I would, as CEO, want to get involved and dig underneath it, because when you're doing these surveys, things you didn't realize were happening, you find out about.
Yeah, I think makes a lot of sense. And you're right, that's the power of them. And you mentioned it there, and you did mention it before, and I didn't ask at the time, but you mentioned you're a disciple of strategic account management. What is that, and why are you a disciple of it?
Well, it was developed by Miller Hyman, and we were sort of didn't pursue the Miller Hyman methodology to the letter, but the principles of understanding, first of all, what your client's business problems are and researching them and analyzing them and playing what you do into that context is, for me, rule number one. So I've got a little exercise I play which demonstrates that context is so much more powerful than content. And this almost comes back to the value proposition capability argument. A lot of people talk about what they do. They don't really talk about really the context of their client and then play what they do into that. So it forces you to think that way, but it also forces you to think about how your projects went. It also forces you to think about your client relationships, where you're sponsored, where you're not. What have you done for those clients in terms of reciprocity and giving something back? So essentially, driving all the actions that you need to do in terms of learning about your client's business model, learning about your client's environment, learning about who perhaps hasn't appreciated what you've done and what you can do about it, but also making sure that you remain relevant and top of mind by investing in content, point of view. And that can mean hospitality, but I'm not a great believer in doing hospitality as part of business development. We would generally do hospitality as a sort of a celebration of and a thank you after a piece of work rather than pre. I was never keen on doing it that way.
Yeah, I really like that context rather than content. And actually, I guess comes back to, like you did say on value proposition, is if you can see why it matters to me as the client, it makes sense. And actually, I can only make content make sense in my context, because otherwise it's, especially today's world, like it just goes past on your LinkedIn feed or on whatever else you act on. There were a few, I know when we caught up ahead of this, Mark, there were a few things that you shared some notes around sales, and this account management piece comes into that. And I'm interested, well, I may have got this completely the wrong end of the stick, but there was a few phrases that I just loved. And I just wanted to, they may sound random to our listeners, but murder boarding, is that part of account management? Is that part of sales? What is that part of?
It's pitch preparation, really. It's the idea, and we learned this from one of our clients, which again, I think is perhaps illustrative of what I've been talking about through here, is that nobody has all the right answers, but you've got to make sure you learn on the journey. So we learned this from one of our clients. It's the idea that when you go into a pitch, if you've rehearsed it right down to the choreography, then you've got a much better chance of winning. But the murder boarding process is somebody acts as if they are the client and is much tougher on the pitcher than a client is ever going to be. So if you say something, you've got to justify it. You iron out the differences between the team. You iron out the timings. You get rid of the acronyms. You do all the things that irritate people, but you've got to behave. The person that you appoint as a client for the murder boarding session has got to be, the most painful, difficult, procurement executive that ever lived. And essentially that means once you've been through that process, your timings are right, your choreography is right, your facts are right, you're much better prepared for the difficult questions, and you feel like a team as well. They're the different. We called your listeners will forgive me to how can I say descend into the vernacular for a minute. We have the 6 Ps, which is that prior preparation prevents piss poor performance. So there is no excuse, there is no way you can be good at a pitch if you have not spent time on getting it right. And if you're not prepared to spend time getting it right, then don't enter the RFP process in the first place.
Which I imagine comes back to your point earlier around knowing what to go in for, so that you can devote the time for the murder boarding and all of the things you touched on.
Yeah, and I think even if you lose, and of course, we didn't have 100% pitch win rate and far from it, but make sure at least you're memorable as well. we would be quite creative. I know in one we went with a whole load of remote control cars that were stickered up with different division stickers on the roofs. But it was all about modularity, and we wanted there to be a common system, but there to be different brands. And and we said to the people, these minis are for you to take home and destroy with your family. And we didn't win the bid actually, but one of the people who was on the committee, the appointing committee for that piece of work, liked our approach and got in touch with us afterwards and actually said, "Look, I'm so pleased to make contact with you guys. Really liked you in the bid. Loved the fact that you were soliciting feedback, like your creative approach." And we ended up getting 6 pieces of work with that person, and they never ran a competition before they hired us. So, that's why I've talked to you about the experience of selling. It's not about have one of these 25% off. That's not what selling is. Selling is much more around how you engage and the experience you provide and how you behave.
Yeah, I love that example, Mark. And I mean, talks to what you touched on with your team and exiting people well as well, didn't it? Of life is long and you don't know where people will end up or what the future holds. And actually, if you leave that great impression on a prospective client, you may not win the first piece, but these big organizations are not planning on going out of business anytime soon. And so having that memorable pitch, and maybe not for now, but I will afterwards. I love the idea of having remote control cars everywhere. And I'd love to see the choreography. Because that yielded such a fascinating story, there was another one I had, and you can tell me if this relates to the pitch press or someone else, which was researching the competition and then spiking them. I love how when we get into pitching, suddenly these metaphors or phrases get a lot more aggressive. We've been quite, our phrasing before was quite genteel. Now we're into murder boarding and competition spiking. Tell me more about researching the competition and spiking them.
I'm a big believer in not dissing the competition. Yeah, I respect the competition, and I'm very good friends with the former CEO of the Borton Group, who were, a major competitor as ours, and really liked him, really liked the business. We collaborated in many instances. They had a great Six Sigma training offer. We didn't. We would use them for that, despite competing against them the next week. And I'm a big believer in, where is the problem in that? The big car manufacturers do that all the time. Toyota and BMW make cars in the same factory, which are pretty much identical, and then go and compete with each other on the high street. So it isn't a dissing one, but in particular, when you're up against some of the big boys, you're going to have to point out to the client what the advantage of using you is. And that means that, if you know who you're competing against, we would compete against one organization similar to us that was very much about benefits and didn't sell on day rate, didn't sell on outcomes. It sold on pounds saved. Now, we didn't want to do that. And the reason we didn't want to do that is because we were much more focused on leaving a legacy and training people, and didn't want to spend our time arguing about benefits, which is what it becomes. So knowing that somebody like that was in the competition, we would point out the size of the check that they would have to write for a 2% improvement, and the size of a check they would have to write for a 20% improvement, because generally it gets sold over a 5-year ROI, but also explain to them how much time would be wasted in arguments around the commercials that could be spent doing things far more useful. So, and then equally, if we were going to go against the big four, they've got the brand strength, they've got the bench strength, but we would emphasize very much the experience of our people, the value for money of our offer. So we would be subtle about it. We wouldn't say, "Oh, you're going to be with X big four and they're really expensive, and you're going to train loads of their graduates as part of your fee. And, you do realize the 7-figure salaries of the partners, blah, blah, blah." That is the sort of thing you don't want to do. What you want to do is emphasize what you do that they don't do. But if you know who your competition is, then you can do that. And of course, we were big in our niche. So I would sit there and say, you do realize that a lot of the big four come to us and borrow our people because they haven't got enough people to do this. So please don't think that if you're going to choose us, because we're only 250, that you're going with a small fry. We're pretty much the biggest in what we do. So you need to go in and be bold. And it wasn't a lie. We were the largest in our niche. And but if you don't know who you're competing against, then you don't have a narrative that is going to make people, consider the upsides that you possess and maybe not look at the upsides in quite the same frame as they might have done. So hopefully nothing honest in that, I hope. But because I repeat, dissing the competition is not something that I adhere to at all.
Well, and I guess it's like what you said with what you did with your team of you aren't going in with that negative win-lose. You are going in with a win-win mindset, and the client will pick the best option, and you're showing them why you're the best option without, to your point, tarnishing a brand image or perception of you as the people who are being negative about someone else, because at some point that always comes back to bite you in a way.
And you know what? I spent 10 years thinking that spiking the competition was evil. And then you realize that everybody's doing it to you, but they're not doing it in the saying, as you say, that you're bad people. They are concentrating on their strengths to highlight your weaknesses. And it's no more, and that's fair. But you've then got to be just better at it and smarter at it. And if genuinely that your insight on it is not one that matters to the client, well, it's not going to work, is it?
Well, and to your point as well, at the end of the day, clients are human, consultancies are human, and sometimes it just comes down to someone prefers so-and-so for so-and-so's reason. And, we've all had those pitches where it just comes down to a fit, and we've won work and you've won work as a fit, and we've lost work and you've lost work because it's not that fit. And so to your point, all you can do is that positive spiking. It's the same as sport, isn't it? You play your best game and you try and maximize your strengths and the opposition's weaknesses, and one team's going to end up winning that game, or it could be a draw. My limited football knowledge tells me we've done a lot of that over the last few weeks, but
yeah, no, it's a good analogy. I definitely agree.
So, Mark, we've covered a lot of ground, and there was just something. You touched on role models throughout this, and I guess I'm always interested. It's partly why I asked for books, because I always think books can give you so much insight from people who've gone before. I guess I'd be fascinated who, if you were looking back, is there anyone or anyone's who had that big impact on your career? As a leader, you read those books you mentioned, Strategy of a Dolphin, for instance, had a huge impact. But actually, was there anyone, be it your time in France, be it since then, that really impacted how you became, the leader you did?
Yeah, I don't want to overplay the leader I did, but thank you for the question. So when I first went out to France in 92, I was really fortunate to be put in part of a team by a guy by name Lionel Fabre. So Lionel was about 10 years older than me and was just absolutely the right type of person for me at that time. I wasn't as confident as I probably should be. I was in a foreign country. My French, whilst improving rapidly, was a bit scratchy. And I was gone in as a languages and business graduate into an engineering situation. But he was very good. We would have a wrap up every evening and we would explore together what I'd done. He would make me discover where things had gone well and where things hadn't. So I was able to critique what I'd done, so that rather than him telling me that I hadn't got it right, we got to a place where I told him what I'd got wrong, and he would then ask me questions around, well, what would you do differently? So the change curve was so much faster because it wasn't a sort of traditional feedback session. It was very much about discovery and exploration, where he was just asking short, open questions, which is a skill in itself. He was also taught me one big life lesson, which is to share your vulnerabilities. So, I'm not going to say what his sort of bad experience in life was, but he was strong enough to explain to me what happened in his childhood. And I developed an enormous amount of empathy with him, and I could share, some of the difficulties that I'd had in my childhood, which was mainly linked to we've met, Nick. So, I've got quite an extensive birthmark, which is to do with having a venous system that didn't develop properly in the womb, and you get teased about such things growing up as a teenager. But having a sort of soul mate as a boss with whom you could share vulnerabilities and meant that we had an enormous amount of respect and empathy for each other. And I ended up supporting him. When we were closing a factory down in Texas many years later, I remember he was not very well. I had to chuck him into a boiling hot bath to get his system to work again. But you wouldn't do that for somebody that you didn't like. Most people would have just called the American Health Services, and we'd have ended up with a $20,000 bill, I imagine. But all he really needed was to be thrown in a scalding bath to get his system to go again. So he was somebody, though, that by bringing me in and listening and also exploring and sharing vulnerability, showed me that there was so much strength in not pretending to be strong. And I think that helped, because actually a lot of my better or best client relationships were based on the fact that people understood that I and our team were vulnerable. And I'm a big believer that sharing vulnerabilities is sort of an ultimate test of whether you're a real person.
Wow. It's a fantastic story to share, Mark, and be vulnerable about the story and actually the impact it had. I guess for others wanting to do that, and maybe you had this with people in your organization, how do you foster that vulnerability and giving that time to have those meetings? Those end of day wrap-ups, for instance, are quite a lot of time. There's a lot of involvement. How did you do? Is it you just go first and others follow? Does it come back to that kind of what you were talking about, role modeling it? How did you pay that forwards?
Yeah, so I love the expression "pay that forwards," by the way, which I think is what a lot of this is. I think the consulting lifestyle lends itself well to that, because you are traveling, or certainly when I was doing it, you were. So you were away 3-4 nights a week. And even if you were prepared to work till 9 o'clock, the client had generally gone by 6:30. So as a team, you did get opportunity to spend quite a lot of time together. And so that was really where we had, you got to know each other beyond, cars and football and family and mortgages and all that tedious stuff. But obviously it takes trust and people wanting to open up. But so I think it was the opportunity, the time, and the lifestyle and we were all very happy to stay away, not forever, because we did end up starting families, and it did end up becoming difficult to do quite as much staying away. But we were formative times in the first 5 years of doing the work that we did. So that's where you can do that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think, like you say, those days when you did, and I assume consultants do go now back to client sites after COVID, but those days when you are away 3-4 or nights a week, it gives you that time. There's an interesting as well, just on the other side, you mentioned that vulnerability with clients, because again, that can feel quite daunting. If you've been brought up being trained that everything should be perfect to the client, they should always feel like it's all going well. How did you strike that balance as well? Like, how do you get that vulnerability in a way that clients respect and really buy into?
I believe that telling a client that the project's not working before the project has gone terminally bad, it is a strength. I think that what clients want is they want expectations management. They want to know the truth. They don't want nasty surprises, but they're prepared to deal with bad news, but they don't like nasty surprises. So you can always do something about a problem if you share it, and if you explain to somebody that it's not, what a consultant will typically do is tell the client that it's their fault because their people are no good. Well, guess what? They sort of knew that when they hired you, and you knew that, and that's the whole reason you're there in the first place. So that doesn't really wash as a reason. But we would have problems because we perhaps underscoped it. We might have problems because there was a political infighting that we could do little about. But the client has then got an option in terms of how to use you and how to do something about it if you do that. But obviously, to be able to share that vulnerability, to share the problem, you've got to have built trust with a client such that they don't feel that you're playing them as well. So how does that happen? I think you need credibility. You need to have a great work ethic and motivation. But probably my big one there is most people spend their life trying to be interesting. And and it's another person taught me this, Mark Cheshire, who was one of my early clients. He said, look, you've got to be interested rather than interesting. Yeah. So if you could demonstrate you're interested in my problem and you're interested in me, then actually I'm going to sense that you're batting for me and I'm going to forgive you loads. But if you spend your life trying to be interesting, that means your self-orientation is getting in the way of this problem. So I think if there's a heuristic from this, is be interested rather than interesting.
Well, I think a great heuristic, Mark, and I think a nice place to draw us to a close as well, because I think we've covered a ton of ground, and I think that encapsulates a lot of what we've talked about today. Be interested in your clients, be interested in your people, and all of the good things that will follow. I have two last questions that I ask all of my guests, and we've already started into one of them, but I'm going to ask it because you may have more. And the first one is the book or books that you have gifted to others the most or have had the biggest impact on you, and why is that?
So I've already talked to you about two, which is Create Space. Well, three, actually. Derek Draper's book on Create Space, which is fantastic. I've talked to you about The Strategy of the Dolphin. I've talked to you about I'm Okay, You're Okay. But I'd add a fourth one, as you asked, which would be Black Box Thinking by Matthew Syed, which I think is fantastic. It deals with so many topics, root cause analysis, safety, a lot of what's going on today. We talked about heuristics a minute ago, but the reason sort of populism is on the rise is because, people do leap to conclusions off from simple headlines and, believe things and are sort of what I call system one rather than system two thinkers. They're all Homer Simpsons believing the headlines. There's no Captain Spocks out there actually doing some analysis on what's the truth.
I love the recommendation. I love the phrase as well. If we had more, there's probably a round two, Mark, to pick up the difference between Spocks and Homers, but I won't ask it now, but I can guess.
Yeah, end up being rude, so you'll have to delete everything, so best not. Yeah.
And then the last question, and this could be as much a recap as something new, is you have three people in front of you. One is a graduate just entering consulting, where you were when you went off to France. The other is a manager grade in consulting, that kind of middle of the ranks. And then the third is someone approaching partner or leadership team, and depending on your structure. And the question is just what one piece of advice would you give to each of those people?
To the grad, ruthless self-organization. Absolutely ruthless in how organized you are. Yeah, a lot of people at that age, I think, don't understand how much you can get done in a day and how key it is to be really well organized, diary management, lists, not too many lists, hopefully, but be on top of things. Yeah, a lot of graduates fall over because they're not used to that. I think to the person who's sort of 4 or 5 years into the business, I'd come back to make sure you lead with context rather than content. I think that separates the people in their late 20s, early 30s, those that are going to go somewhere, those that are, understand business models, understand the context in which they're working and can talk to that. And then at a partner level, make sure your narrative's not about you and it's about your client.
I love that, Mark. Well, I think three fantastic pieces of advice. That is everything I wanted to talk about today. And thank you so much for sharing so much. It's been a fantastic journey. As I say, it ticked a box, scratched an itch from a long time ago when I was a process consultant. How has OEE grown so fast? I now have the answers to many years later. And the very last piece, I have some of. If anyone wants to get in touch, find out more about you, where would you point them to? Where can they find you?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, 3 or 4 times a week. I accept 95% of invitations, and so if LinkedIn works from your perspective, Nick, let's go with that.
Amazing, Mark. I'll put your LinkedIn along with the books in the show notes. So anyone who's listening, they can go to those, find them, connect with you, and go from there. Well, Mark, thank you for this. As I say, I've really enjoyed it. It has given me a lot of food for thought, a lot that I didn't know before. So thank you for making the time. Really enjoyed it, and all the best for the rest of your week.
Thank you, Nick. Really enjoyed spending time with you this afternoon.
Cheers. Today's episode is brought to you by Create Engage, the specialist digital marketing agency for the disruptive management consultancy. Now, for long-time listeners, you will probably already know who we are. You may have even heard one of our ads on a previous episode of this podcast. But for those of you who don't, here is a short introduction. At Create Engage, we help you create an effective marketing strategy for your consultancy, a strategy that will resonate with your target clients. And then we support you by delivering the campaigns you need to turn that strategy into a reality, helping you to build your brand, raise your profile with your prospective clients, and ultimately generate return on investment from your marketing activity. Now, I could tell you about many of the great clients that we work with and the results we've delivered for them. But instead, I'm going to do something much more powerful and something that I would recommend you do for your own marketing. I'm going to let our clients do the talking for us. If you are currently thinking about marketing for your consultancy, you're going to want to listen to this.
Create Engage started the process for us. They managed it end to end. They came up with some really creative ideas, and we were really happy with the work that they did, which meant that we could just focus on running the business. Not only did we start conversations with clients that we hadn't spoken to before, but also there was tangible return on investment by some work that we were given.
They've helped right from the initial shaping of the idea through to helping us work out what our end goal was. They've supported us with the visual identity and our positioning of the brand.
We've had an immediate expansion of our network and have initiated a raft of new conversations with owners, CEOs in target client organisations, and has led to us winning new projects already.
One of the greatest compliments, I guess, is that one of our competitors even said that they really like what we're doing with marketing and they wish they could be doing something as good.
So from our perspective, we couldn't recommend Create Engage any more than this.
I would certainly recommend Create Engage if you're a consulting firm. They really understand consultancies and the sort of challenges we face. And I don't think you're going to get much better marketing anywhere else.
So I wouldn't hesitate to recommend Create Engage. They did a really good job for us.
So if you're looking for an agency that can help you achieve the results that our clients just described, then head to our website, createengage.co.uk, where you can find out more about how we support consulting firms like you. You can download our latest ebook and you can get in touch to talk about how we can help you take your consultancy to the next level through digital marketing. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Climbing Consulting. If you have any guest recommendations, comments, ideas, thoughts on how I can make this show better for you, just drop me an email. It's nick@createengage.co.uk, and I really look forward to hearing from you.